Okay, so I might go ahead and introduce our speakers. So we have Sam Perlow-Freeman, who is Research Coordinator at Campaign Against Arms Trade. Sam focuses on UK military spending and procurement and the role of the arms industries in fueling conflict. We have Ali Jamil, who is a former researcher at Muwatna for Human Rights and now involved in investigations and reporting on weapon remnants and the ICC communication, which you'll hear more about shortly. Currently, he is in the role of Accountability and Redress Officer. Our next speaker is Omar Ferwati. He is a researcher with forensic architecture. He trained as an architect and currently researches how civilians use architecture to survive urban conflict, particularly in Aleppo. Finally, we have Emily Thornberry MP, who has been a member of the Labour Member of Parliament for Islington South and Finsbury since 2005. She has served as Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade since April 2020. She's previously held the position of Shadow Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs and Shadow First Secretary of State. Great, so with that, I'll just do a quick introduction to Campaign Against Arms Trade and who we are. CAAT is a UK-based organisation working to end the international arms trade. In February 2021, we were truly honoured to receive a joint nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize with our Yemeni partners, Muwatna for Human Rights, which makes us all the more delighted to have Ali here with us today. This nomination was intended to draw attention to the suffering of the Yemeni people and to CAAT's judicial review, which challenges the UK government's decision to resume arms sales to the Saudi-led coalition bombing in Yemen. On behalf of CAAT, I would just like to take a moment to offer our solidarity to the people of Yemen, whose lives continue to be deeply affected by this conflict. Indeed, the aim of this event, first and foremost, is to draw attention to the suffering that the Yemeni people are enduring and to call for accountability for the complicity of European companies and governments for violations of international humanitarian law in Yemen. 6 years into this conflict, there continues to be clear patterns of violations of law, and yet arms exports to the coalition continue unabated. I can see that there's more of you have joined since I've done the introductions. And I just also want to say, thank you for joining. We're kind of at almost 150 people. And although this is a remote webinar, I'm going to imagine all of you in a theatre together, which would be quite full at this point. And I'd invite you to do the same. So with that, I will hand you over to our first speaker, Sam, Research Coordinator at Campaign Against Arms Trade.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you to all our panelists and audience for joining us. The war in Yemen has now been going on for 7 years, and the Saudi coalition rolled in it for over 6. Over 130,000 people have been directly killed in the fighting, including 13,000 civilians in targeted attacks, and many more as a result of hunger and disease in what is the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. Over 24 million Yemenis are in need of humanitarian aid, and hundreds of thousands face starvation. This crisis is a direct result of the war. The destruction of health facilities, infrastructure, and agricultural facilities, the Saudi-led blockade of Houthi-controlled ports, and the obstruction of humanitarian aid by all parties. Coalition airstrikes, chiefly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, had killed 8,772 civilians in targeted attacks up to March 2021, according to the Yemen Data Project. Nearly 1/3 of all airstrikes have hit civilian targets, while in another third the target was unclear. The coalition has repeatedly targeted hospitals, schools, densely populated residential areas, marketplaces, civilian infrastructure, and large civilian gatherings such as weddings and funerals. Ali and Omar will say more about these patterns of attacks later. The UN panel of experts for Yemen, along with human rights organisations such as Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and of course Muwatna for Human Rights, have investigated many of these attacks in detail and concluded that a large number of them are highly likely to be violations of international humanitarian law, IHL, and in many cases war crimes. These bombings have been carried out using aircraft from the US, UK and France, and with bombs and missiles from the US, UK and Italy, and other equipment from other countries. A little over half of Saudi Arabia's attack aircraft are UK-supplied Tornadoes and Typhoons, with the rest from the US. The UK and US governments and arms industries provide a constant flow of spare parts, maintenance, repair, training and other support, without which the Saudi air war could not continue. The supply of the deadly weaponry used in this war is thus not a one-time thing. It is an ongoing, daily activity in which both the governments and arms companies involved willingly participate in full knowledge of the horrific consequences for the people of Yemen. As you may know, Campaign Against Arms Trade is once again challenging the UK government's decision to continuing licensing arms exports to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen. In 2019, the Court of Appeal ruled that the government's process of deciding on these licenses was irrational and unlawful, and ordered them to retake the decisions based on a lawful process. Last July, the government announced that this review was complete, that any violations of IHL by Saudi Arabia were only isolated incidents, and thus the sales could continue. This April, CAAT was granted permission for a new judicial review challenging this outrageous decision, which we believe flies in the face of the overwhelming evidence of repeated attacks on civilians and civilian objects in violation of IHL. Our judicial review, however, is a matter of administrative law, of how the government conducts its business and takes decisions. If the court finds, once again, that the government has violated UK arms export control laws, they will not be finding anyone guilty of a crime. Yet, the horrific crimes committed in Yemen by all parties and the complicity of Western governments cry out for accountability and justice. Ali will have more to say on Watana's efforts on the ground to promote accountability. Doing so faces huge barriers in an ongoing conflict where the warring parties show little or no willingness to hold their own to account, and where external parties enjoy the support of permanent members of the UN Security Council. The International Criminal Court also lacks jurisdiction over the warring parties, as neither Yemen nor the coalition states are signatories. I hope that one day those responsible for war crimes among the Houthis, Yemeni pro-government forces and militia, and coalition governments and armed forces will one day face justice. Right now, that seems some way off. However, the European states that continue to arm the Saudi coalition are parties to the ICC. It is typically citizens of the UK and other European countries in government and industry who take the decisions to supply arms, and the decisions are taken on the soil of these countries. These acts of supplying the arms that are used to commit atrocities in Yemen could therefore potentially fall under ICC jurisdiction. It is with this in mind that in December 2019, a coalition of NGOs led by European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights, and also including CAAT, Watana, Amnesty International and others, presented a submission to the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC, the OTP, asking them to open a preliminary investigation into whether government officials, elected and civil servants, and arms company executives may be responsible for aiding and abetting war crimes in Yemen through the provision of arms. This includes arms suppliers in the UK, France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. The submission ran to over 300 pages with extensive details, both of the atrocities committed in Yemen, the arms supplied, the evidence of their use, and legal arguments. This file is sitting with the OTP, who have been examining the evidence submitted, and ultimately with the new Chief Prosecutor, UK lawyer Karim Khan QC. Any process like this takes time, of course, but we hope that we may see a decision on whether to take the investigation forward sometime this year. If the case is taken forward, it will represent a major new step in accountability for abuses committed with arms acquired through the international arms market. In a few cases, individuals have been prosecuted for their role in enabling war crimes by supplying arms, such as a Dutch businessman convicted in the Netherlands for supplying arms to the Liberian war criminal Charles Taylor. But when it comes to arms supplied with the permission of governments, we are only just beginning to see criminal investigations on this. In Italy, prosecutors have been ordered by the courts to reopen a case that they wanted to drop into RWM Italia for supplying aerial munitions to Saudi Arabia used in Yemen. The case was brought by the Italian peace group Rete di Disarmo. No similar cases have been brought in other arms supplying states. The ICC, of course, is only authorised to act where national authorities cannot or will not pursue cases themselves. This case also breaks new ground in putting arms companies, rather than just government policies, in the spotlight and challenging their insistence that everything they do is perfectly legal as it is authorised by governments. But companies have their own duty of due diligence over the impact of their activities on human rights in the countries in which they do business. Companies will rightly go into great detail on how they ensure their supply chains do not involve modern slavery. Yet arms companies refuse to take any responsibility for the actual use of their lethal products. They shift it all to the government issuing export licenses. Yet at the same time, they go to great lengths to influence government arms export policy, enjoying a privileged voice in the corridors of power. They also elide the fact that an arms export license may permit the supply of arms, but it does not require it. We believe they should not be able to evade their own responsibility in this way. Even for the ICC to open an investigation would put decision makers, political and corporate, on notice that their decisions to arm warring parties are not simply matters of economic profit and loss, or a bureaucratic matter of finding an interpretation of export license criteria that suits their foreign policy or defense industrial interests. They are literally matters of life and death, and ones for which they may one day be held personally accountable. We believe that the evidence of war crimes in Yemen and of complicity on the part of Western governments and arms companies is overwhelming, and you will hear more about this evidence in the coming talks. We hope that Karim Khan and the OTP will follow this evidence and pursue this investigation as a major step towards accountability in this terrible war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think that was a really both clear and detailed outline of how we have got to where we are. I was particularly struck by the new ground that this case would cover if it was opened, particularly for the concept of accountability in legal terms, both for government authorities and for private companies. And I think, although some of us might be familiar with this already, but hearing the number of countries involved in exporting arms to the Saudi-led coalition for use in Yemen really brings home how this is a European problem and European complicity in this war. Thank you very much. So now we will have Ali Jamil, Accountability and Redress Officer at Muwatna. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for those who are joining us today. The war in Yemen is now over its 6 years, as Sam said, and has caused what the UN has described the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The humanitarian situation has been gravely affected by the serious international humanitarian law violations and grave human rights abuses by warring parties on all sides of the conflict, including Ansar Allah, the internationally recognized government, and the Saudi UAE-led coalition, and also, of course, other groups affiliated with these warring parties. Muwatana is a Yemeni human rights NGO that works on documentation of IHL and IHRL violations by all warring parties in Yemen through a team of field well-trained researchers on almost all Yemeni governed rates. Since 2014, various local and international human rights organizations, the panel of experts, the group of eminent experts, have documented a wide range of abuses, including indiscriminate attacks, ground attacks, the use of landmines, attacks on health facilities, recruitment of children, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and sexual and gender-based violence. But these numbers seems to be not heard by some states. I'll just put here some numbers for you. Between March 2015 and March 2021, Muwatana documented at least 577 airstrikes impacting civilians or civilian objects, which killed about 3,820 civilians, including 966 women, 405 children, and wounded about 3,000 civilians. Among coalition airstrikes impacting civilians, Muwatana documented the use of US weapons in 25 airstrikes and British weapons in 5 airstrikes, and also one case of Italian weapon. Also between March 2015 and March 2021, Muwatana documented repeated attacks on health facilities, including 35 incidents of airstrikes of the Saudi-led coalition. It's clear that all warring parties to the conflict, including Saudi UAE-led coalition, have committed violations that may amount to war crimes in Yemen. It's really frustrating that warring parties are still capable of getting arms, despite all the humanitarian suffer and all the reporting on it. I'm putting some more emphasis here because for a person who's working on human rights in Yemen, it's really frustrating because all of this suffer could have stopped 1 year ago, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, if serious steps toward accountability and stopping to fuel this war with weapons. What we are calling states, including UK, is what GE, panel of experts, CAAT, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other human rights groups have called on to stop transferring weapons to warring parties in Yemen and to do reassessment to all military cooperation with all countries involved in the war in Yemen and make sure they are not supporting those countries in committing war crimes in Yemen. Actually, there is a lot more for UK to do to end the humanitarian suffering in Yemen, including ensuring accountability in the agenda of UN Security Council and ensuring that UN Security Council should refer the situation in Yemen to the ICC to ensure comprehensive accountability. For the past 2 years, Muwatana have tried to map all possible avenues of accountability for Yemen. And it seems very difficult for us to go for possible avenues because there isn't actually much to do. But Muwatana have worked with ECCHR and other partners on a case submitted to the prosecutor in Rome in Italy, and also communication to the ICC Office of Prosecutor. But this is actually not our ultimate goal. Muwatana is pushing for a well-comprehensive accountability that address all the warring parties and all violations in Yemen, which could happen by referring the situation in Yemen to the ICC. Actually, with credible accountability and redress, this is the only real generator for durable peace in Yemen. In the absence of justice, the same individuals and entities that have already caused suffering for civilians in Yemen, including by undermining peace and stability in Yemen, will continue their acts and their behavior, threatening Yemen, the region, and the entire international system. Thank you.
Ali, thank you so much for your presentation. I was particularly struck by your mentioning of the UN Security Council. The UK, as a permanent member of the Security Council, there's no vote that's going to happen here in the UK that will mean that that we will not be on that seat. That power will be retained by this country, and if the Saudi-led coalition can continue to act with impunity without any accountability, what kind of standard does that set at one of the most powerful tables in the world? And what does that mean for accountability? It's very concerning, and thank you for raising that. So now I will bring us on to our third speaker, Omar Ferwati, who is a researcher with forensic architecture. Thanks, Omar.
Thank you very much. So Forensic Architecture is a research agency based in Goldsmiths at the University of London that undertakes spatial media analysis as evidence of human rights violations. The platform that we've created here was the first project of the Investigative Commons, an expanded community of practice and collaboration with ECCHR, Bellingcat, Yemeni Archive, and other partners. We are a multidisciplinary group. We're comprised of architects, artists, software developers, lawyers, and archaeologists. And we use spatial tools and develop new research methods to investigate cases of human rights violations. Time Map is an interactive cartographic platform, which is the basis of this work. We've developed this to analyze and visualize complex and layered data over space and time. And we've done that over many projects, from advocacy to legal processes, and has been used in human rights court cases before. Time Map allows us to research human rights violations by national and corporate agents on a scale of territorial violence and state sovereignty that is otherwise hard to articulate comprehensively. Our code base of how this is made is open source and available for anyone to use. In this platform, we've done for the first time allowed to see airstrikes in Yemen in direct relation to the actions of European arms manufacturers, both spatially and temporally, correlating them to other events in European countries and public knowledge about violations in Yemen on the timeline. We've investigated arms manufacturers, including those in the UK, in relation to the airstrikes on the ground. And this is the prominent aspect of the platform we'd like to highlight. The platform was allowed to be made because of a collaborative methodology and workflow. We want to highlight this for a quick reason, which is to understand the organizations that were a part of this, including open source researchers at Bellingcat, ground researchers in Yemen, legal researchers at ECCHR, and media from the Yemeni Archive, allowed us to extend our single capacity to gather, verify, process, and communicate a large volume of data, which in turn has strengthened the investigative reach and value of this work. This workflow allows us to directly draw media from Yemeni Archive and online and see this side by side by researchers like ECCHR and Bellingcat's evidence of airstrikes on the ground. This work culminates in a unique and comprehensive repository of visual evidence that links between European arms and countries with airstrikes on the ground in Yemen across a period of 5 years. I'll just briefly explain some of the platform's main features to understand this relationship. First, on the map, we see airstrikes plotted, and for each one, we can click on it and inspect its details and media. We can more closely inspect this media as well. And at the bottom, you see these kind of bars, and this is the timeline, basically events that are occurring over time. We call these events the evidence of complicity. These are events that happened in Europe and relate directly to the bombing in Yemen. You can click on each one and see what happened at each point. You can also filter about what type of evidence shows up on the timeline, whether it be UN and NGO reports, parliamentary discussions in the UK and abroad, arms deals, decisions, services, and actual licenses. You can also understand the actual airstrikes occurring on the ground by what was targeted, from hospitals, schools, civilian spaces, and cultural properties, as well as the details of those strikes, including whether remnants of arms were found, whether there were consecutive strikes, as well as whether there are civilian casualties at any given point. We can also understand these events on the timeline in relation to the countries, and we can filter and choose which countries we want to focus on. And lastly, by selecting a company, you can see the airstrikes related to it. The solid line that we see on the map means there were remnants found on the ground, and the dotted lines on the map indicate potential links that were understood according to the products and services provided by those companies. In the timeline at the bottom, you also see the events in Europe that relate to that company as well. Decisions, export licenses that relate to them and their exports to the coalition. Clicking on an incident with a remnant, you can actually see the details of the remnant and the media related to it, as well as the manufacturer. So we'd like to highlight two configurations of the information in this platform. The platform first demonstrates the impact of European arms exports in the continuous targeting of civilians. And second, sorry, let me see here. And it does so by exposing the relationships between documented airstrikes, found remnants of European companies, and products they provide that aid these strikes. By selecting any European arms company for the first time, you can see for yourself their certain and likely footprint in the bombing of Yemen. In some instances, remnants linking to a European arms company, as I've said, were actually found and documented at the sites of these strikes. In airstrikes where remnants were not found, likely connections still exist based on exclusive services from European arms companies that were provided to the coalition in their assault on Yemen. While a company is selected, you can also see a series of events in Europe that relate to their exports, bans, and decisions. To understand the role of the UK and UK arms companies, I'd like to show an example. And if we wanted to isolate, for example, just the UK, the events happening in the UK, as well as some events that were happening, including an export to Saudi Arabia. And then, for example, if we wanted to understand the role of BAE Systems as a company on this map of airstrikes, we can see what services it provides, that it provides fighter jets to the coalition, and that we can understand this service in relation to a series of connected airstrikes. While still looking at that company and seeing where it's potentially linked to those strikes, we can directly begin to make connections between those violations on the ground and the services provided by those companies. In the second configuration, we'd like to point your attention to the timeline. Here we take a closer look at the relationship between events in European countries, which are again the evidence of complicity, as we call them, and the violence and frequency of airstrikes against civilians and civilian spaces over time. In this timeline of events, we can clearly see that arms deals were made, licenses were granted, exports fulfilled from Europe to the coalition, despite overwhelming cumulative public knowledge of violations in Yemen linked to European arms. This knowledge includes NGO reports and parliamentary motions and discussions across Europe. Looking at the exports from the UK, for example, we can see that they regularly continued despite an intense frequency on both sides. At the top line, you can see the frequency of airstrikes before and after a single export decision. In UK events more broadly, we can see reports and parliamentary motions in relation to attacks on civilians. We see here, for example, that the Prime Minister was defending exports to the coalition just weeks after a civilian hospital was struck. We can see these things in relation to each other over space and time. So together, our platform shows that European arms companies, including those in the UK and European countries, including the UK itself, are instrumental in the ability of the coalition to carry out its assault on Yemen civilians. The platform also demonstrates how their continued trade of weapons, despite overwhelming documentation of violations, makes these European countries and companies inexcusably complicit in potential war crimes. And we hope to continue to add events, companies, and countries involved in the assault of Yemen in this platform to demand accountability. Thank you very much.
Omar, thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating, but also very illuminating. I'm sure there's many people in the audience, myself included, who are, and we've said it here today, Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian disaster. The headlines speak about famine. We know about cuts to the aid budget here in the UK, for instance, but it doesn't paint a full picture of what complicity actually means. And the platform is such an excellent way of people from all different disciplines to explore that. And I'd really encourage people to share the platform with your colleagues. If you can tweet about it, if you can use it in your research, if you can use it to make the arguments that we've been making here. Yeah, thank you very much. So last but certainly not least, we have Emily Thornberry, MP, who is the Shadow Secretary of International Trade and a member of the Labour Party.
Thank you very much, Katie. Can I say what a pleasure it is to join such a distinguished panel of experts in Sam and Ali and Omar. And on behalf of the Labour Party, can I take this opportunity to congratulate the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, Omar Watana, for human rights on your nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize, due to be announced in October. We all know dozens of people and organizations are put forward each year for a Nobel Peace Prize, some very deserving and some very undeserving. But you can always tell whether a nomination is serious, who is responsible for putting it forward. So when we see far-right MPs from Italy and Norway putting forward the likes of Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu for the 2021 Peace Prize, we know those nominations can just be dismissed as offensive jokes, the offensive jokes that they are. But when we see the international Quaker movement, who know all about global struggle for peace, putting forward CAAT and Watana for their work on the Yemen conflict and on the judicial review into UK arms sales, then that is true recognition of the global impact that your work has had. And I want to join the Quaker movement in congratulating both organizations for those efforts and in wishing you well at the prize event in October. I was reflecting yesterday that it's been 5 years since I became Shadow Foreign Secretary, shortly before Boris Johnson took over the job on the other side. And I sat down that day 5 years ago and wrote out what would be my 4 priorities in terms of where I wanted to focus. I wanted to focus my pressure on the government. And I wrote down, number 1 was Brexit, number 2 was human rights, 3, climate change, and 4 was Yemen. And then that November, I added number 5, which was Donald Trump. And the reason I focused on those priorities is because they were the areas where, to my mind, fundamental deceits were being practiced on the British people and on Parliament in terms of what the government was saying, compared either to what they were doing or compared to the reality of the situation. And in the case of Yemen, compared to both. And when you look back on the last 5 years of UK statements on Yemen, you can see a true catalogue of deceit, with the government story shifting each time some new truth was uncovered, or each time some potential liability needed to be hedged off. Remember just some of the rows of the past 5 years with the British government over basic issues of fact. First, they said cluster bombs were not being used, then that they were being used, but they weren't British made, and finally, that they were UK made, but several years old. And then we had the assurance that Saudi airstrikes were not affecting civilians because we were told UK personnel were in the room helping with the targeting. And then that story changed rapidly and we were told UK personnel were in the next room giving advice on targeting. And finally, it changed totally and we were told UK personnel was nowhere near the room and were not involved in targeting at all. And remember the promises we were given, that a full assessment had been conducted, concluding that the Saudis were not violating international law, followed by a change in the record saying that no such assessment had been carried out. All this confusion spread to New York, where 1 week in October 2016, The Guardian was briefed that a draft UN resolution had been circulated by the UK delegation proposing an immediate ceasefire on all sides and an independent investigation of all war crimes, followed a fortnight later by ministers questioning whether such a resolution existed and agreeing with the Saudi ambassador to the UN that even if it did exist, it certainly was no longer required. And throughout this time, we have gone through the usual routine in relation to each individual bombing in Yemen, the pictures of devastation and death emerging from the ground, followed by the angry denials that Saudi planes were responsible, followed by the insistence that the target was legitimate, followed eventually, and in some cases, by the grudging acceptance that there may have been a mistake. And of course, as we all know very well, the icing on this very rotten cake, when it comes to the duplicity of ministers, came as a result of the Court of Appeal's ruling in 2019, when in the space of a year, we went from ministers insisting that it was not possible for them to carry out their own investigations into the circumstances of individual airstrikes in Yemen, to them suddenly being able to carry out precisely those kinds of investigations, just so that they could declare that all the risks had been properly assessed and that it was safe to resume the sale of arms. Liz Truss looked me square in the eye over the dispatch box in the House of Commons, and she insisted that while isolated incidents had taken place where international law may have been broken, that because these took place, quote, at different times and in different circumstances and for different reasons, they did not amount to a pattern of behavior. There was no basis on which to conclude, she said, that Saudi Arabia lacked, quote, either the intent or the capacity to comply with international law. She told me the conclusions of her department's investigations and analysis were sufficiently robust to set aside the ruling of the Court of Appeal. And yet, to this day, she refuses to publish those investigations or the department's analysis. She refuses to say which incidents it examined or which were deemed to be isolated examples where international law was breached. She refuses even to say how many such incidents there were, so that we can know how she defines the term isolated. She has refused to explain how the United Nations panel of experts could review exactly the same evidence and emerge with precisely the opposite conclusion, particularly when it comes to a pattern of behavior. She has refused to explain how the systematic destruction of Yemen's farmland, food processing plants, fishing boats, and markets throughout 2016 did not constitute a pattern, let alone the surge in targeting of buses and cars in 2018. And of course, she has refused to explain how she can square her insistence that the Saudi coalition has the intent and capacity to comply with international law, with its proven use of child soldiers, with its torture and sexual abuse of detainees, and with its use of starvation and siege tactics as weapons of war. I have stood at that dispatch box in Westminster opposite Liz Truss, just as I did opposite Boris Johnson, and before him Michael Fallon, And in all of those debates, I have tried appealing to their sense of logic and reason. I have tried appealing to their sense of legal responsibility. And at times, I have even tried appealing to their sense of morality and decency, and the feelings that they must have surely of conscience and shame. These surely must lie somewhere deep within them, when they know that their decisions are responsible for the deaths of innocent children in Yemen. But all that has stared back at me are the cold, callous eyes of individuals who could not care less about any of those appeals and cannot see past the pound signs on the bottom of the export license forms that when they are put in front of them to sign. I've seen nothing like it during my time in politics. I've seen similar elsewhere in my life during my early years of my legal career in the 80s. I saw it when I was representing striking miners one week and gay men being prosecuted for indecency the next. And from the police forces I dealt with, I saw the same look in their eyes, not interested in logic or reason or truth or morality, not bothered by appeals to their conscience, just the cold, callous indifference of men who had decided the outcome already and wouldn't let anything get in their way. And believe me, going up against the government for the last 5 years on Yemen has been much worse than going up against corrupt police forces in the 1980s. And this has provoked much greater rage in me, because then it was a matter of blatant disregard for justice that could profoundly affect someone's life, but it rarely ended it. But I'm here to tell you tonight that that is why this work means everything and why your work is so important. Let me give you this message to everyone who is working for the campaign against the arms trade and Watana, and everyone who is supporting your work and watching this evening online. You are the answer to everything that I have just said about the attitude of the British government and the callous indifference of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, what is happening in Yemen. They're never going to change their position now. They're never going to stop selling arms for the use in this horrific conflict. They're never going to end the suffering that their indifference allows to continue. They're never going to do any of that unless they are forced to do so by the British courts, or failing that, by the court of public opinion. And that is why everything that you're doing to win this judicial review, to persuade more members of the public to sign up to this campaign is so vitally important. I've spent 5 years leading the campaign in Parliament along with the likes of Keith Vaz and Andrew Mitchell, and we will keep doing our utmost at every chance that we get. But I know that it is your work that will make the most difference in the end. Because as I found in the 80s, when you can't persuade others by appealing to logic or truth or morality, the only way that you can win the argument is by appealing to the law and winning your case in open court. And that's what you're doing, and you will continue to have my full support. And when you succeed, as I'm confident that you will so deserve that Nobel Peace Prize. And more than that, you will have taken a giant step to the prize that we are all pursuing, which is an end to the sale of arms for this terrible war, and a final end to the war itself, and an end to the suffering of the Yemeni people. Thank you.
Emily, thank you so much. I don't know where to start. I think you have not only just posed questions to the UK government, but many questions that we ourselves as residents or as citizens can ask ourselves and our representatives, particularly looking back on that history of inaccuracies and what that means for truth. And it was very interesting seeing Omar speak first and then you, when you have a platform of truth, of data, of evidence, of facts. And then when you look at what's happened in Parliament for the last 6 years since, and what that means for the British public, and how we can tackle that. And CAAT, CAAT is its supporters. So thank you for speaking to them too. We have opened the Q&A. I will pose one or two questions to the panel first, just to get them warmed up if they weren't already, and then we will go to the chat. So my first question was that there are a number of countries across Europe and elsewhere, this includes Denmark, Finland, Italy, Norway, the Netherlands, and the United States, which was in the news a couple of months ago. They have imposed some restrictions, sometimes only temporary, on arms deals to Saudi Arabia. However, even within the UK, even within Europe, the UK is an outlier and hasn't failed to restrict arms at all, apart from the outcome from the judicial review that CAAT brought last year. Why is this the case, do you think? If any of the panel would like to take a whack.
Well, I'll start if I may. And first of all, I just want to thank Emily again for your words, your very kind words, and everything you said, and for the stalwart support that you have given, well, to the people of Yemen on this issue. The fact that you've been unstinting in putting this issue forward in Parliament and asking the really tough questions, showing up the gaps in the MOD's own tracker of incidents, which is not something that we'd worked out to do before ourselves. So it's really amazing that what you've been doing to push this issue in Parliament. On the question, why is the UK an outlier? Well, Emily said plenty about the character of the British government, which certainly contributes to that, but also being cynical. For the most part, the countries that have restricted arms sales is the ones who had lower volumes of arms sales to restrict in the first place. So Britain and France, who have much bigger contracts, haven't. The US has restricted some sales, the bombs and missiles, which is a smaller element, not like the aircraft or the continuing maintenance and support that they give to those aircraft. So yeah, it's easier to convince governments to do the right thing, unfortunately, when they've got less at stake in terms of the level of arms sales. But it's also very much the amount of political pressure, the amount of legal pressure, and the character of the government.
Thanks, Sam.
I mean, I think that's right. Can I just add that I think that there is, I mean, I think that Joe Biden's contribution has been really important. I mean, I hear what Sam says, that it's not as much as we had hoped, but for him to be talking about what was happening to the civilians in Yemen and referring to it as murder, it was very important. And, by following it up in the way that he did, I think has been important. He's suspended the sale of arms for use in Yemen in February. And although there may have been some form of rowing back, nevertheless, the principle, I think, is established. And the question is, how does the British government answer that? And I would say that over and above my strong criticism of the way that this Conservative government is behaving, I think that there is also problems with the way in which we have our legislation drafted, quite clearly. I mean, to hear, from across the dispatch box, these people continually telling me that we have the best arms restrictions in the world, and it was drafted by, and it was the legislation coming from Robin Cook, to which my answer is, I was a friend of Robin Cook's, and if he had thought that this arms legislation would be able to be used in this manner, he would be absolutely turning in his grave. And it's our duty, therefore, if there are these problems, and if the courts can't make a decision in the right way on the basis of this legislation, we need to change the legislation.
Thank you very much, Emily. I had a second question, which maybe I might kind of pose to you, Omar, which was, what can the public do to use not just the platform, but any information they have available to have impact and to try and call for accountability?
Thank you, Katie. I think there's a discrepancy or a difference between the availability of evidence and the supply of evidence, the abundance of evidence, and the understanding and pressure created by the public. I mean, as Emily mentioned, that this changes when the public demands it. But in order for the public to demand it, they need to understand it in a way that makes it clear the complicity of their own government and the complicity of companies in their own country. So for a long time, and I think purposely, this is muddled up in public discourse on behalf of politicians that would say it's complicated and like Emily mentioned, this is old, this is new, we have these restrictions. Narratives changing are a part of that. What a platform like this does, or what I hope it will do, is to take the amazing work that's already been done by researchers on the ground, including by Muwatana, and think about how we can understand that consistently in relationship to those companies and those countries as a direct link to understand the footprint of countries and companies in the war in Yemen, rather than understanding them as separate events or entities, which is, I think, how we've been thinking about them as a public. So I hope it's about by kind of bringing the visual evidence kind of to you, presenting it so that you can see for yourself as someone in the public about what's going on. And I hope that would be what incites that demand the change from the people up.
Thanks, Omar. That's really useful and something I'll be reflecting on myself. So now I am going to go to the Q&A chat box. I've seen one question which is specifically for Emily from Max Westby at Amnesty International. He has asked if she thinks that a written parliamentary question could be tabled using the forensic architecture evidence as proof of the non-compliance of the UK government with international law, and specifically with Articles 6 and 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty. Surely it would be very difficult to dispute this evidence, but I guess, Emily, you have kind of touched on that already, that it is in some cases just a complete lack of application of the law that's there, or it's interpreting it in a way which completely destroys the meaning and the intention that it had when it was drafted.
Yeah, I mean, given that the government are saying that it's not a pattern, we have been asking lots of written parliamentary questions in order to try to establish what that means, and have been, I've written, I don't know how many, 50, 60 written parliamentary questions to the Department for International Trade, who weren't being terribly helpful. So we then tried the MOD, and actually the MOD, to start with, kind of started answering our questions before they realized what they were doing, and they stopped. And I think now what they're doing is they're using the excuse of the legal action to say that they can't answer the questions at this stage. But we did get somewhere, and we have been working with CAAT, as you know, working out exactly how we can angle these questions and exactly how we frame them to try to get as much information as we can from the government. But they're very good at blanking us, and I'm afraid that's what we're getting.
Thanks, Emily. And I think it's interesting to hear of 50 questions plus, and that you still might not have your question answered, and that's the system that we're dealing with. I have another question here from the audience, and please do continue to put your questions in the Q&A box. Ali, maybe perhaps this might be one for you. Can someone explain why the coalition is engaged in a war with Yemen? So that's maybe some general background.
Well, the war in Yemen started in September 2014, when an armed group called Ansar Allah Houthis took control over the capital of Yemen and imposed house arrest on President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi. In March 2015, President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi managed to escape to Aden and announced Aden as temporary capital of Yemen. But the group that controlled Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, started to expand to the south until it reached Aden. And they did several airstrikes with the Yemeni Air Force on the residents of Hadi. And on that time, Hadi fled to Saudi Arabia and asked for help of Saudi and other Gulf countries based on a previous agreement that Yemen have signed. So then in March 26th, the Saudi Arabia and UAE announced the coalition in Yemen. This is the general narration of what happened in Yemen, but there should be for sure other reasons when we speak about geopolitics and economics.
Great, thanks very much, Ali. I have another question from Linda Rogers. What would the sanctions be if accountability for war crimes was proven? That's quite a legal technical question. I don't know, Sam, if you want to give that a go, or I suppose that's, yeah, particular legal angle, so might not be.
I think Ali or Omar or maybe Emily as a lawyer might be able to say more about that.
Okay, well, maybe pass on that one. I have another question which I find quite interesting, that the UK is pen holder at the UN for Yemen.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I kind of feel like we ought to make some attempt to answer this. It's terrible. Nobody answered that at all. I mean, so I think that the reality is that unless there are individuals who are pointed to, you know, in international criminal courts, then it is a question of kind of geopolitics. It is a question of embarrassment and shame. And so be it a question of being held to account by the international community. And so a lot of this is about larger politics than an individual being put in the dock. I mean, we certainly do see, you know, there are instances, but we have yet to see, certainly since the Second World War, a politician from a developed country being in a dock anywhere, and I don't imagine we'll see that anytime soon. But the steps are worth taking, because it is so profoundly embarrassing for a country to have any suggestion that they might end up in an international criminal court in any form.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, in theory, this ICC case, this submission, if it proceeds, is looking into whether individual politicians, top civil servants, senior arms company executives have committed the crime, might have committed the crime of aiding and abetting war crimes in Yemen. It's a very long way down the road before any of those individuals might end up in the dock. But what we are certainly doing with this ICC submission is asking that question.
And it really puts the bejesus up, you know, international lawyers in the Foreign Office and the MOD, and it does make the civil servants kind of extremely concerned, because obviously the last thing they want is to have advised their government to have made profoundly wrong decisions like this.
Yeah, I think those points actually build quite nicely onto the other question I was going to ask, which is that the UK is pen holder at the UN for Yemen. Should the pen be passed to a nation that is neutral? I think that question gets at a lot of interesting factors of how this war has continued. And I think what you were saying, Emily, as well, that Yemen has been the victim of a serious failure in foreign policy of Western nations, particularly. I mean, US policy has changed, but UK hasn't. Has every single point has held fast over the last 6 years. It's interesting how we could call for such a thing, and how more pressure could be placed for different actions of the Security Council.
I mean, there was a motion, as I referred to in my speech, you know, that was briefed to the Guardian, and I mean, I had a copy of it, you know, you know, parties at the UN sent it to me. So, you know, so we knew it existed, and there I was standing in the chamber waving it at ministers, saying, you know, what are you going to do about this? You have drafted this, so what are you going to do? Is it really true that the Saudi Arabians have vetoed it, which is effectively what happened? And if that's right, then how can we hold our heads up high as you know, as not being on, you know, if you're supposed to be a referee, you're not supposed to be running around the pitch scoring goals for one side or the other, or, you know, selling the balls. I mean, it's like you're just supposed to be, you know, independent, and that's the last thing that, you know, that we can be seen to be in these circumstances, of course. And it's shameful, you know, it's shameful, particularly, as I say, if you pull a draft resolution, you know, from the table because it's widely thought that it embarrassed the Saudis, and they insisted that it be taken away.
Just on that, I mean, I can't directly answer the question of pen holders, but on the influence the Saudi government has over UK foreign policy in relation to the region, it's just monstrously excessive. Countries selling arms often justify it that selling the arms gives them influence over the recipient. But when the UK arms industry is so dependent on arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the influence works the other way round. So when it comes to Saudi Arabia's egregious human rights abuses at home, the murder of Khashoggi, their actions in Yemen, again and again, we see the UK government playing defense for Saudi Arabia and stopping them from being held to account. And it is because they are terrified of the prospect of losing their largest arms export customer. So it totally distorts our foreign policy in the region.
Thank you, Sam. It's such a good point, and I think effectively Saudi has other options and the UK does not. And I'd invite attendees to have a look at CAAT's browsers, where you can see the value or the quantity of export licenses, particularly to Saudi Arabia, and that the UK industry is so reliant that there's no one else who would pay that much as what Saudi are doing. I have another question here from Tina Vendrels. Is time mapping used as valid evidence when looking into achieving accountability? Omar, maybe you could speak to that.
Sorry, I was not even quick. I think it has a good potential for that. I mean, I only say that because it has had precedent in admissibility in courts, most recently studying with ECCHR, the conflict in Ukraine. It's called the Ilovaisk platform. So you can see how that report was administered in the court. And I think there are exciting potentials for this to continue. But I mean, I think that would be up to the lawyers in charge of those cases also.
I have another question here from Chris. Is Andrew Mitchell the only Conservative member of the UK Parliament who talks sense on Yemen? If anyone would like to pick that up.
I was just thinking about that because I saw the question in the chat. Now, I have to say that I mean, Tobias Ellwood, when he was he's the MP for Bournemouth, and when he was a junior minister, he seemed to be kind of constantly wheeled out to defend the Saudis and was sort of known as the MP for sort of Riyadh East, and yet, since he's left government, I believe he has come out recently and said that we should review our arms sales to Saudi for the use in Yemen. So that's been a complete turnaround, and actually credit where credit's due, frankly, particularly since it's been a very long journey for him.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Emily. Well, with that, I think we are done in the chat with questions. I'd just actually like to invite all of our speakers to make any concluding remarks, if you'd like, based on our discussion or based on your presentations. Sam, maybe if we'd like to start with you, if you if you're ready.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you to all of the other speakers, Ali, reminding us of just exactly what it is that we're talking about and what's going on in Yemen. And Emily for the really cutting political analysis and strong support, and Omar, the forensic architecture platform is just amazing. I really hope that it helps our cases, both the judicial review and the ICC case. I hope it also sort of really starts to inform and open up the patterns to those who need to be informed and to understand, and who are capable of being convinced. Our work as Campaign Against Arms Trade on arms to Saudi Arabia continues. It continues in the judicial review, where the case, as they say, is ongoing. We are waiting for the sort of complex process of arguing over open and closed evidence to take its time. But we believe that the case that that these sales are not only immoral but illegal under UK and international law is overwhelming. We believe that we will win this case, and which, as Emily says, under the current government seems to be the only thing that might stop UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia. We also hope that the ICC will also pursue this and put further pressure, put the bejesus up ministers and arms company executives and civil servants to actually think about the consequences of their decision. And our work continues in the court of public opinion among our supporters. You know, writing to your MPs, it really is something that that they take notice of in the media and so forth. We believe that the UK policy on arms sales to Saudi Arabia is a moral outrage. It is one that we will continue to fight, and is one where we believe that we can win. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. Ali, would you like to make any concluding comments?
Thank you very much for everybody. Thank you, Sam, Emily, Omar, and Katie.
Thank you very much, Ali. Yeah, we're so delighted that you were able to speak. Omar, do you like to say anything?
Yeah, just as well, that it's been such an honor to be with you, Katie, Sam, Emily, and Ali, and only to say that we should continue to share and push this work. And I think it's not over, that we can continue to build on this platform, that it shouldn't be static, but a continued tool of advocacy. And I hope we can continue to work with you and others on that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Omar. And yeah, and for the work, I know that the platform was done through a collaboration of a coalition with many organizations. So, you know, there's many people to thank for the output that you've produced. And finally, Emily, if you'd like to make any concluding comments.
I think it's all been said. I mean, I think this has been an excellent meeting, and thank you for organising it, and thank you for all the people who've been involved. This is a question of us all fighting this together, and making sure that people's voices are heard. And although increasingly people know about Yemen, not enough people do. Not enough people know how bad it is, and what our role is in this, and how shameful it is. And so the more people, more conversations you can have, the more people you can contact, the more you can campaign on this, the better. We must not rest until this terrible injustice is dealt with. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you to all of our panelists. A couple of words just that I wrote down because they struck me when you said them. I think when Emily said logic, truth, and morality, these are the things that we are fighting for. And certainly this event was very informative and very interesting, but it was also an event with purpose. And that purpose is to draw attention to what's happening in Yemen and the lives of the people that are affected by that conflict, and what our role as people living in the United Kingdom or living in other Western European countries is. Thank you very much for joining, and please do look on CAAT's website if you want to get involved, if you want to see what petitions are running. There's lots of information there, and of course myself and Sam, please do reach out to us personally if there's something that you'd like to follow up on. Thank you everyone.